The air on Zara 6 tasted like whetstone and burning salt, heavy and thick even for the seasoned breathers of its desert moons. But to a human, it would have been unbearable. At least that's what the alien boy had always been told. Yet standing, under the twilight shadows of the fallen dome, barely clinging to the remnants of their home, he saw something that didn't make sense. A tall figure in black cloth, dust-covered and scarred, stepped out from the edge of the broken landscape, breathing. Without a mask, the boy's large violet eyes widened, shimmering under the cracked dome glass. As he whispered with both fear and a spark of impossible hope, "A human?" The sound of crumbling steel and distant sirens echoed like ghosts of a world already buried. He clutched the frayed shawl tighter around his bony shoulders and watched the figure walk closer, slow, careful, not a threat, but not entirely safe either. "Please," the boy said, his voice raspy but urgent, "please don't leave. My mom, she's still alive. She's not strong anymore. She tried to give me her rations. I didn't let her." His little claws trembled as he pointed toward a collapsed corridor. "She said no one would come. That humans had already left. That the war took everyone decent. But you're here. You're real. You can help." The human man said nothing. At first, just lowered his gaze and took in the ruin. Then, after a heavy silence, he knelt not like a soldier, but like someone too tired to pretend anymore, and looked the child in the eye. "I came here to find salvage," the man said, his voice a low rumble like rocks tumbling down a mountain. "But maybe I found something more." The boy's eyes glistened. "Will you come with me?" he asked, hope cracking through the fear. "Will you see her?" The human man nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth twitching not quite a smile, but close. As they made their way deeper into the shattered colony, through corridors painted with soot and silence, the boy suddenly stopped, turned, and said something that broke the air itself. "Please. Marry my mom. She's all I have left." The man froze, the words hanging like ash in the air, and for a moment, all the sirens of the past, all the grief, all the war became silent. The boy wasn't asking for love. He was asking for survival, for dignity, for family. The man said nothing, but he followed. Asterisk, he hadn't meant to care. That was the first lie the human had told himself when his boots touched the dust of Zara 6. This was supposed to be a ghost-run salvage, tech, maybe some forgotten plasma cells to trade off world, but not this. Not a child with bruises under his eyes and a voice that sounded too old for his little body. Not a boy whose first request wasn't food or water, but for a stranger to marry his mother. The words kept echoing in his chest, even as they walked down a corridor thick with decay. The boy moved with instinct, guiding him through the remnants of a once beautiful colony, where alien architecture twisted like vines in metal, where walls breathed softly from old biotexture, but everything was dying now. The self-healing systems had long given up. Power flickered like a heartbeat ready to stop. And yet, the boy kept going, like it wasn't the first time he had crawled through grief in the dark. The human stayed close, watching every corner for danger, but his thoughts remained on the strange plea. Marry her, not save her. Not carry. Her, Mary, as if that word was still sacred in this broken galaxy. "Your name?" he asked finally as the boy ducked under a cracked archway. "Yil," the boy answered. "It means light before thunder in my mother's tongue." The man gave a small nod. "I'm Mason, just Mason." Yil paused, looked up with wide eyes, and then said something quietly that nearly broke Mason's stride. "You don't smell like a killer." Mason winced. He had killed. On Earth, in the Orion Rebellion. On worlds with names he'd rather forget. But he supposed the boy meant something else. Maybe that he didn't carry that death in his breath. "Anymore. Not today," Mason said. Today I'm just breathing. They reached what must have been a living chamber. Its dome had caved inward, but one side of the pod still functioned, barely. Inside, wrapped in faded sheets and lit by the flickering green pulse of emergency biolamps, was the boy's mother. Her skin was pale lavender, her ridges dull and cracking, like a flower kept too long without water. She was asleep, no, not asleep, fading. Every breath looked like it hurt. Yil rushed forward, taking her hand, whispering soft alien syllables that seemed to soothe her even in half-consciousness. Mason stepped in slowly, the weight of the room pressing against his chest. She opened her eyes, and he saw immediately she was proud, not of him, of her son. Even dying, she summoned a smile for the child who had somehow brought a stranger home. "Human," she whispered, her voice dry like sandpaper, "you should not be here." "Neither should you," Mason replied gently, "but here we are." She tried to sit up. Mason stepped forward and studied her without hesitation. She was light, too light, like holding air wrapped in bones. "My son, he's brave. He thought you'd save us." Mason glanced at Yil, who stood back now watching. "I didn't come to save anyone. Then why are you here?" The woman asked, her eyes sharp despite her weakness. Mason didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out the only thing he had of value, a wrapped ration bar, and handed it to Yil. "Give this to your mother. Slow. Small bites." Yil nodded, already moving to unwrap it. Mason sat beside the pod and leaned back. "Your boy asked me to marry you." The woman blinked slowly, surprised. And then, incredibly, she laughed. It was weak and cracked, but real. "He did, didn't he?" "He meant it," Mason said. "And not for the reasons we'd think." "I know," she whispered. "He thinks marriage means you'll stay, that we won't die alone, that someone will care enough not to leave." Mason was quiet for a long time. "And would I be wrong if I said that's not what marriage means anymore?" "You would not be wrong," she said. "But to a child who's watched too many people walk away, the meaning becomes survival." Mason turned to her. "What's your name, Sella?" "Sella," he repeated. "I don't know what I'm doing here, but I didn't walk away." "No," she said, reaching out and touching his hand. "You didn't." Yil, watching from the corner, didn't speak, but there were tears in his strange eyes, tears that shimmered like starlight. For the first time since the dome fell, since the world ended, he didn't feel alone. A human had come and stayed, not as a hero, not as a soldier, but as something much rarer in a galaxy filled with war, a witness who did not turn away. Asterisk. The days bled together on Zara 6, where the sun no longer shone in full, and the cold crept in through even the strongest alloys. Time passed strangely under the fractured dome hours, stretching out like the limbs of the dying biomechs buried. And the sands outside, Mason didn't know why he stayed. He had told himself at first that it was pity or guilt, or some old soldier's instinct to protect the weak. But each time he looked at Yil, curled up beside his mother, whispering songs to keep her awake, or feeding her tiny crumbs from the ration bar as if they were gold dust, Mason felt something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Not since Earth, not since the unit, not since her. He remembered another small voice, another child that never lived to grow tall enough to call him Dad. That pain had been buried under war and noise. For so long, he didn't recognize it at first. But here, in the quiet breathing of his dying family, it rose again. Sella, even weak, was sharp. They talked in low voices when Yil slept, or when he wandered out to scavenge, stubbornly believing he could still fix things. She told Mason of their people, the Sorari, how they had once lived in floating gardens and sang to machines that healed instead of harmed. But the war had erased beauty first, then voices, then choices. We weren't warriors, she said, coughing into the crook of her elbow, but the galaxy punished us like we were. Mason listened, not because he had to, but because her voice filled the silence that had rotted inside him for too long. He found himself watching her when she spoke, noticing how her eyes stayed bright even while her body failed. There was a dignity in her unshaken by suffering. One night, with the stars hidden behind the dust storms, Mason woke to find Yil curled up against his side, trembling. Bad dream? Mason asked, voice soft. Yil nodded without looking up. You left. In the dream you left, and the sky fell again. I didn't leave, Mason said, placing a calloused hand on the boy's back. You're still here, and so am I. Yil gripped his jacket tightly. Mom used to say the sky was our shield. Now it's broken. But when you came, the wind stopped howling. Maybe humans are a better shield. Mason didn't know what to say to that. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was too much, too soon, and too heavy. Still, he stayed still, letting the boy cling to him like an anchor. In that moment, he wasn't a salvager. He wasn't a soldier. He was just someone who had stopped walking. The following days brought slow healing. Mason rigged together a heat generator using parts from an old mining drone and some leftover cryofuel. It stank and buzzed, but it worked. He built a water collector out of the dome's still-breathing flora, and they began to gather sips of life again. He found a medkit in a half-buried escape pod and, under Sella's careful instruction, gave her the injections she needed barely. Enough to keep her conscious, but enough to dull the pain. I don't want him to watch me fade, Sella said one evening, her voice stronger than it had been in days. I want him to remember something before the end. Mason stared into the distance. He already remembers your strength. Sella smiled faintly. Then maybe he should remember yours too. Mason blinked. I'm no one's hero. No. She said gently, you're something harder. You're someone who stayed. That night, around a small makeshift heater made from broken tech and stolen warmth, Yale brought out a small Orba hologram recorder. It flickered weakly, but the image it projected was sharp enough. A dancing woman with bright eyes and strong arms, holding a baby who laughed and squealed under an alien sun. Sella, younger, whole. I play it when she sleeps, Yale said. It reminds me of who she was, not who the war made her. Mason sat back, watching the flicker, feeling like he was trespassing in something holy. And for the first time in years, he allowed a tear to fall. Not for himself, but for everything the galaxy had broken. For everyone left behind. For a family that somehow still believed love could grow from rubble. Yo looked up and whispered, do you think humans can love aliens? Mason didn't answer at first. He just watched the light of the old memory shimmer across the dome. I think love isn't about species, he said at last. It's about staying when you don't have to. And Yale smiled not like a child, burdened by survival, but like a soul that had just been seen. Truly seen. Asterisk, the wind returned on the fourth cycle, harsh and full of warning. It howled through the broken cracks in the dome, shaking loose metal and sending a ghostly whistle through the corridor walls. Mason knew that sound. It wasn't just weather. It was a carrier of something worse, something watching, something coming. He stood at the edge of the fallen observatory and stared out into the dim desert beyond the perimeter. And there, rising like shadows from ash, he saw the shimmer of patrol lights. Not human, not Sarah. Something else. And suddenly, the way Sella's voice had dropped in recent days, the way her eyes darted toward the sky when she thought he wasn't looking, it all snapped into place. She hadn't told him everything. Not even close. He returned inside, colder than before, and found her half awake, Yale asleep by her side. They're coming, Mason said. Who? Her eyes flinched, not in surprise, but in guilt. The culling fleet, she whispered. I didn't want to tell you. I was afraid. If you knew, you'd leave. He knelt beside her, jaw clenched. Tell me everything now. Sela exhaled slowly, her body weak but her mind sharper than ever. After the war ended, or what the galaxy called the end, the unified systems issued a purge protocol. Any non-compliant colonies deemed unstable were ordered to be dismantled. They called it preventive extinction. She looked down at her son. Our people were never aggressive, but we refused the trade deals. We didn't want your weapons. We wanted to stay whole, quiet, alive. That was enough to sign our death sentence. Mason shook his head slowly, fury boiling beneath his skin. And no one stopped it? No one could, she replied. The council had already scattered. Earth had gone silent. Your people disappeared after the final siege. We didn't disappear, Mason growled. We withdrew. We were tired of fighting wars for others. Tired of watching good people die for bureaucrats playing God. She reached for his hand. I know. That's why Yale called you a shield. He still believes in you. Mason's voice was quiet now. And what about you? Sela didn't speak right away. She only looked at her son, then back at Mason. I hoped. But I didn't expect. Her voice cracked. You weren't the first to land here. Others came, scavengers, smugglers, pirates. None of them stayed. Mason swallowed hard. And the coaling fleet? They scanned for activity, signs of life. Any heat signature that suggests survival. We've been careful to stay dark. But when you turned on the generator, she didn't have to finish. Mason already knew. He'd given them away. He stood up, his heart thundering. How long? A day, maybe 2. Unless they're already here, Mason paced. His mind ran through old field tactics, evasive maneuvers, power drains. He had a few stealth panels left in his ship, but it was half buried. 2 clicks away. No way to prep in time without exposure. They'll burn everything, he muttered. Even the soil. Sela nodded. They always do. The silence that followed was suffocating. Yale stirred in his sleep, mumbling nonsense syllables, still locked in a dream where life made sense. Mason looked at him for a long time, then turned. To Sela. Why did you stay? Because of him, she said softly. Because I didn't want him to grow up thinking survival means running away from every fire. Mason turned toward the dark hallway, his voice like gravel. Then we make sure this fire doesn't take him. He spent the night rewiring everything. The broken comms relay became a decoy beacon. He set up false heat signatures in the West Wing and rigged 3 backup capacitors to explode on remote command. If the culling fleet came scanning, they'd see chaos and debris, a failed trap, a dead zone. Just another ruin. Just another successful purge. But even as he worked, the questions gnawed at him. Why was this child's plea still echoing in his soul? Why had Mary her hit harder than any? Battlefield command. Was it really about marriage? Or was it about belonging? About rebuilding something they'd all forgotten existed? At dawn, Mason returned to find Yale awake, watching the orange haze filter through the broken dome. You were gone, the boy said. I was making us harder to find, Mason replied. Yale nodded, then hesitated. Do you still think I was wrong to ask you to marry my mom? Mason crouched in front of him. I don't think you were wrong, he said. I think you were brave. Yale's eyes lit up. So, will you? Mason didn't smile, but something warm flickered behind his eyes. Let's make sure we all survive the next 2 days first. Then we'll talk about forever. And for the first time since the war began, the boy laughed, not the laugh of someone who was safe, but of someone who believed again. That somehow was stronger. The warning lights flickered at dusk. First, just a tremor in the motion sensors Mason had buried beneath the sand using ancient Siri scrap. Then a second signal, this one unmistakable. A soft, high-frequency pulse. The kind that wasn't supposed to be audible, but Mason had been a soldier too long to forget the feel of it. A scout drone, silent, invisible to most, but present, watching. The culling fleet had arrived. He didn't wake Sella. She was too weak, her body trembling from the effort of breathing. Yo lay beside her, one tiny clawed hand resting on her ribs, as if trying to keep her tethered to the world. Mason stepped out into the stormlit dome, his rifle slung low, his jaw clenched. It wasn't the old kind of fear that gripped him now. It was something different, something worse. He could lose them. Not strangers anymore. Not just survivors. Them. The boy who saw him as a shield. The woman who had taught him how to feel again, without ever asking for anything in return. They had become his people. He activated the decoy system. 3 thermal signatures flared across the ruined outpost, each one mimicking organic motion. He watched the sky shimmer, the clouds torn apart by an invisible beam as the drone scanned. It passed over the false targets once, then again, then paused. It was thinking, or whatever counted as thinking for a machine bred for eradication. And then it moved, not west. Not toward the planted signals. It moved toward the heart of the dome, toward them. No, Mason muttered, his fingers shaking with rage. No, you. Don't. He bolted through the halls, grabbing the secondary detonator and his final flare beacon. He ran past the chamber where Sella and Yul slept, heart hammering, wanting to stay, needing to stay, but knowing what had to be done. He had to wait it away. Had to give them time. As he emerged into the open crater, the sand whipped against his face like needles. He activated the flare and hurled it high. A searing column of light split the dark sky, a beacon of desperate heat. The drone changed course instantly, slicing through the storm toward the flare. Mason ran. It chased through jagged rocks and dead fields. He sprinted, legs aching, lungs burning. He didn't have to outrun it, just distract it long enough to lose its interest. But as the terrain changed, he realized something. He was running toward the wreckage of his own ship, his exfil plan, the only way off this cursed moon. And it was already too late to reroute. The drone fired. A beam of scorching plasma sliced past his shoulder, searing the cliffside and sending molten debris raining down. He dove into the pit, rolling behind a fractured hull panel. Sparks hissed in the rain. The drone hovered above, scanning, confused. Mason pulled the detonator from his vest. If he triggered the core capacitor now, it would overload the entire zone. The drone would be destroyed, but so would the last functional piece of tech that could get any of them out alive. His hand trembled over the button. Do it, his mind screamed, but then he saw it. In the reflection of his visor, a small glowing light Yul's orb, the hollow memory he always carried, still playing a flicker of his mother dancing with him as a baby. Somehow it had fallen from Mason's jacket. The boy must have tucked it there earlier. It glowed like a heartbeat, like a plea. Mason lowered the detonator. He couldn't do it. Instead, he pulled the flare pistol from his belt and fired it straight into the air. A second flare red, wild and defiant. The drone shifted again, uncertain. Then it turned toward him. He ran, this time not to escape, but to lead it. He ran straight toward the canyon gorge, an old crater known to be unstable. He'd seen the maps in the ruined control room. Just a few steps beyond the edge, the rock would collapse if he timed it right. The ground cracked beneath his boots. He leapt across the gap as the drone followed blindly. The moment it passed overhead, he aimed and shot a steel harpoon bolt into the weakened ridge above. The explosion? of rock was instantaneous. The drone flailed in confusion as boulders rained down. One struck its wing, then another. It spiraled. Mason rolled down the far slope, panting, ears ringing. When the dust settled, the drone was gone, and so was the last chance of ever leaving Zara 6. He staggered to his feet, bleeding, exposed, alone, but a live dot, and more importantly, they were alive. Back in the dome, Sella had woken, coughing, panic in her eyes. Where is he? She whispered hoarsely. Yale clutched her arm, tears welling. He went outside. He made the sky red again. He's saving us. She closed her eyes. He always was, she whispered. Asterisk, he returned long after nightfall, limping through the broken dust like a soldier rising from his own grave. His body ached in ways he hadn't felt in years deep, primal wounds where flesh met fatigue and memory met regret. Mason had escaped the drone by inches, but he hadn't escaped the truth. The coing fleet wouldn't stop. The drone was only a scout. It had already relayed a signal. They were coming. This time not to scan, but to finish. Yale rushed to him. First, arms out, voice cracking with relief. You came back. I saw the sky. There was fire, but you lived. I knew you'd come back. Mason dropped to one knee, arms wrapping around the boy like a man clinging to a reason not to disappear. I told you, he whispered. I don't run. Inside, Sella tried to sit up. Pain etched across every movement, but her eyes locked onto his like magnets to metal. You're hurt, she said, voice weak but furious. So are you, he shot back gently. Helping her ease back down Dot, she held his wrist tightly. They'll come, won't they? He nodded once. By tomorrow. Maybe less. A whole division if the signal got through. She exhaled sharply, her grip tightening. Then we won't survive this one. No, Mason said. But maybe you will. He spent that night tearing apart everything: rations, scraps, modules, even the old Sorori biogenerator cores Sella once believed dead. He built one last construct, a shell, a pod, a coffin, a seed he didn't know what to call. It. But it would protect 2 lives, barely. With the camouflage netting he scavenged from his own gear and the stealth plate from the scout drone's shattered body, it might just hide them from the sensors. Might. What about you? Yale asked. Watching him weld the final seams, Mason looked down at the boy, sweat trailing down his brow like rain. I'll buy time. No. Yale shouted. No more time. You stay. You promised. I promised I wouldn't run, Mason said softly. I didn't promise I'd survive. The boy's face crumpled with rage and heartbreak. I asked you to marry her. I wanted you to be my family. Mason's throat tightened. He dropped the tool and took the boy's small face in his hands. And you are Yale. You are mine. And that's why I can't let them take you. Sella stirred from her bed, her voice hoarse but sharp. If you die, I'll never forgive you. He turned toward her, walked slowly to her side, and sat on the edge of her bedding. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mason reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thin band of copper, bent and fused from ship wire. It was crude, ugly, but it gleamed. I'm not doing this because your son asked, he said, holding it up. I'm doing this because when the world stopped making sense, you were the first thing in it that did. Sella's breath caught. She closed her eyes. You don't have to. I know, Mason said. That's why it matters. He slid the band over her frail finger, and for a moment the world paused, quiet, trembling, reverent. Even the wind outside seemed to slow, as if the stars themselves had leaned in to listen. Then he stood and handed Yale a second copper ring, smaller. You hold on to this. If anyone ever finds you, you tell them what it means. You tell them what your family looked like, that it wasn't about species. It was about staying. The boy held it to his chest like it was life itself. Dot by dawn, the camouflage pod was sealed. Oxygen barely enough for a few days, rations tight. Hope thin, but there. Don't open it until the storm passes, Mason told Yale, tapping the side. And take care of her. You lead now. You stay. Yale's eyes burned with tears. You said humans didn't run. I'm not running, Mason said, backing away into the cold. I'm standing, and sometimes that means standing alone. He turned, walking into the desert's rising winds, the sun peeking over the horizon in fractured red light. Overhead, the first dark dots of approaching ships began to swarm like flies, and Mason smiled. He stood tall in the open, arms raised, rifle slung across his back, transmitting a false beacon on open comms. This is Commander Mason Rial of the Human-Terran Union. You want fire, he muttered to the air. Come earn it. And the sky answered with thunder. The sky cracked open like a wound, bleeding fire and ash onto the desert surface of Zar 6. They came not in silence, but in fury, burning beams of synthetic light carving across the landscape, hunting for movement, heat, sound. The calling. Fleet was precise, cruel, efficient. But Mason stood alone in the storm, his figure small against the vastness of death. He didn't flinch as the first drones dropped low, scanning the plains with red-eyed hunger. He had no ship, no army, no hope of victory, just a name, just his humanity. And when he broadcast that name, when he opened his chest and screamed, it into the void, Mason Rial, Terran, last defender. Something ancient stirred across the channels of war. The fleet hesitated, for a heartbeat, a pause, a memory. The humans were supposed to be gone, vanished, retired from conflict. But they were never weak, and they never forgot. Mason made sure of that dot. The bombs he planted didn't aim to kill. They aimed to blind. Bursts of ion disruptors echoed across the valley, throwing false signals and mirages into every scanner. The fleet, confused, fired wildly, leveling the ruins of what had once been a Seruri sanctuary. But deep beneath that ruin, sealed under stealth, the small pod remained hidden quiet as breath, alive with one final heartbeat. Yo held his mother's hand and the copper ring tight against his chest, listening to the chaos outside with wide, unblinking eyes. Is he still out there? He whispered. Sella's voice came as a ghost, barely audible. He is. He won't stop until we're safe. And even as the oxygen thinned, even as her strength waned, she reached out and placed her hand over his heart. Because he became what you saw in him, he became ours. Above, Mason fell to one knee. The air had turned to fire, the dust red, and hot as glass. His weapon was gone, his body broken. But his voice was steady. You can erase records, he muttered through bloodied lips. But you can't erase witnesses. The lead drone hovered before him, cold and indifferent, calculating his worth. And maybe it saw nothing. Or maybe it saw too much because it didn't fire, it turned, and vanished into the sky. Later, when the storm had passed and the winds died down, when silence returned to Zara 6 like a final prayer, Yil opened the pod. The dome above was shattered, the fleet was gone, and Mason was a shadow in the dust, kneeling where the fire had been. One hand pressed to the ground like he was holding the world up with nothing but will. Yell ran to him, tears falling, voice breaking. We made it. We made it. Mason looked up. His face burned, his eyes dim, but his smile, small, tired, full, was the most human thing the galaxy had ever seen. Sella was too weak to walk, but she crawled from the pod, dragging herself with trembling arms. Mason reached for her, lifted her gently, and sat with her in the sand. For a long time, no one spoke. There was nothing left to say, just breath, just being. just family. A week later, a Serera refugee signal, long forgotten and buried in council. Records responded to a distress call Mason had reactivated before the final stand. A rescue vessel rogue, unregistered, but real-landed at the edge of the ruins. They found 3 figures there, a boy with eyes like distant stars, a woman leaning against his shoulder, and a human scarred, limping, but unbroken standing. Between them and the wind, when the crew asked who they were, Mason didn't answer. "You'll dead. We're what's left," he said. "And what's worth saving?" The captain, a grizzled insectoid with half a mandible and too many scars, nodded once. "Welcome aboard, family." They left Zara 6 behind, but the story did not. Die there. In hushed whispers and outlaw stations, in old human bars and Siri memory banks, a tale spread. Of a child who begged a human to marry his mother. Of a man who stayed when all others fled. Of love born not of romance, but of refusal to abandon. Of a new kind of strength, one that didn't come from guns or ships, but from choosing to care. And somewhere, across the stars, whenever the silence returned, someone would always whisper the words, "He didn't run,